On today's episode, what to make for the calls for the send-off rule in footy. We take a look at some trade targets for Carlton and Collingwood and who is next in line to break Pendle's new record. All that and more on today's episode of Zero Hanger TV. All right, so straight into it. So there was a big hit on the weekend from Nank on Jake Lloyd. So Lloyd was unable to return to the game and there's been calls for bringing in the send-off rule.
Yeah, so the match review officer handed down a referral straight to the tribunal for Toby Nankervis. A minimum 3 games. I think it's likely to be 3 games, at most 4, unlikely to be anything less than that. But yeah, obviously with the circumstances of Lloyd suffering a concussion, unable to play out the rest of the game, Toby Nankervis going on to have a pretty big say in the result with his efforts from that point onwards. Certainly, had a few people kind of suggesting, well, that's the perfect example of bringing in a send-off rule that would maybe see that incident itself analysed shortly after, and then a decision upstairs kind of made to have him sit out the rest of the game, just like Lloyd had to with his concussion. I'm not in favour of the decision. I think it kind of opens up a door for a lot of contentious outcomes that we already kind of get with the MRO, and whether we are bringing some more money into kind of having someone in a bunker type role or throwing that responsibility on the kind of the people already in the arc. I think it's just an easier way to kind of go about this. We're already getting punishments through the MRO for incidents like this that are now, kind of extended a week or 2 with the outcome of the injury. So yes, Nank gets to play out that game, but I think he's also looking at probably an extra week, maybe even 2, because Lloyd got concussed. So unfortunate, yes, for a team like Sydney in that position who would go a man down as a result of an incident like that. But on the flip side, I think Nankervis is looking at an extra week or 2 because of that. So he's still going to be missing a full game, potentially 2 full games because of the concussion. Look, I don't think there's a clear winner from kind of bringing in a send-off rule or not. And while this, yes, was probably a very good example of one that could work, I think there are going to be so many that would be falling into grey areas that we could end up seeing a player sent off and then playing next week because of how some of these arguments play out at the tribunal. And then some of these decisions can take up to 3-4 hours at a tribunal. So let alone trying to go through all the intricacies of a bump or a dangerous tackle or what have you in game. I just think it opens up a can of worms that the AFL doesn't need at the moment.
Mm-hmm. Well, it could be something like a sin bin as well, so a temporary sort of send-off.
Yeah, that's another one. Whether they see out 20 minutes. The HIA head injury assessment takes 15 minutes. So if they're to kind of follow suit and then maybe sit out a similar period, then that could work. But yeah, there's a lot that goes into that, and it'd be quite an interesting one, that one.
Yeah, very interesting. So moving over to some trade targets, we're looking at Carlton and Collingwood. We'll start alphabetically. So Carlton.
Yeah, so the Blues, trying to look at what they need. We've kind of looked at maybe some options, some smaller or medium-sized options in that forward line, and maybe one ruck option or ruck forward option that if they lose Tom de Koning, they kind of need to bolster it in that way. Now we know Mark Pittonet is kind of battling through injury, as is Tom de Koning a little bit at the moment, but they do need kind of that second option. Alex Murkov out for the rest of the year with some complications of his own. So they need that succession plan if they are going to lose Tom de Koning. So Nick Bryan from Essendon, off contract, unable to kind of get past Sam Draper and Andrew Phillips in the pecking order at Essendon. He could be that one, just a younger player, has a lot of promise. Brad Scott's noted last week, he's too good for the VFL. And he's off contract this year, so what that kind of comment might mean and what kind of suitors he would have. I think Carlton would be a good one in the case that they lose to Koning, can play forward, can do quite well in the ruck. And he'll get a chance potentially this week if Draper's not back and if Andrew Phillips doesn't, if Andrew Phillips is handed a suspension, which is a chance. So yeah, he's one that they could consider. And then some of those forward options, so like I said, smaller to medium forward options that are off contract. So you look at Sam Sturt from Fremantle, Lockie Murphy from Adelaide, a couple of Victorian boys who are interstate at the moment, and a couple others. Jay Gresham, they've been linked to as a free agent, so he wouldn't cost them too much. Just only from a salary perspective that they would have to cough up a little bit there. And then another one as well that we have was Kyle Lohman. He's the only first-round pick from the 2021 draft who's not signed for next year, so he's one that maybe you keep an eye on. A nice little pressure forward, half forward that the Blues could consider to bring back home as well.
Yep. And Collingwood?
Yeah, so the Pies, maybe more taller defender type role. Now we know they've got more. They've got the likes of Murphy, Frampton, but maybe those third tall options, kind of like your Jeremy Howe, who, where his playing future is, just given his age, is probably one that we could consider. So do they look at an Adam Tomlinson, kind of player that can play at either end of the ground still, kind of, sometimes they need a forward, sometimes they need a defender. He can even push up onto the wings. He's probably a bit of a flexible one. An out-and-out key defender who's off contract is Brandon Zerk-Thatcher at Essendon. I think we might have had him in Adelaide's targets as well. He'd be a great one, I think, for Collingwood if they could pull him over. He'd probably be a bit of a difficult one for them, but yeah, another one that is off contract. A couple others, some younger guys that haven't really played too much. Flynn Perez, Cam Fleeton at North Melbourne and GWS respectively there. Fleeton, a bit of a medium size, can play tall, can play small for the Giants. Hasn't played too much, but if you see enough from him in the VFL, he has a bit of promise, and he'd just be a bargain, cheap pickup for the Pies. Just kind of how they went with Frampton last year. Flynn Perez similar, more of a dashing halfback, offers a bit of run, bit of pace, long kicking. So here's another one, and then an option maybe for the front third this year. Hayden McLean, another Victorian boy from that Sandringham area. But yeah, the Pies could maybe look at him as having that extra key forward to kind of work alongside Dan McStay or Ash Johnson. Brody Mychek, a bit older, so another succession plan type target for the Pies.
Yep. Interesting. All right, so moving over to our rookie rankings, and not a lot of movement, but one of my boys is in the top 8, Judd McVie. Excited about that one.
Yeah, he's one that I've really liked throughout the whole year. He's played every game for Melbourne. He's not this star player that you'll probably get in the likes of Sheasel, Wardlaw, Ashcroft, Humphrey, but he's just been consistent off halfback, taking on some pretty big scalps in some of the opposing small forwards. I think it's just his consistency that gets him in here. So he's been really solid. As you mentioned, not a heap of movement across the top 8. So he comes in at 8th, Matt Johnson falling out, and then George Wardlaw falls back a spot just because he didn't play. He was managed against Geelong, so that opened the door for Seamus Mitchell to come up a spot. And then moving a bit further down the order, we have the likes of ahead of Mitchell, Ruben Jinmi holds his spot, Max Michelini falls back 1, and Bailey Humphrey goes up 1. They swapped spots last week, so those two are pretty close. Just thought Michelini had his hands full with Cole Langford on Sunday. Humphrey was pretty solid against Port Adelaide, and then top 2 staying the same. So after taking the lead a week or so ago, Will Ashcroft at number 1, one of Brisbane's best against West Coast, and then Harry Sheasel at 2 after his performance against Geelong.
Yeah, so hard to knock those two off. Honourable mentions?
Yeah, so this week I thought Anthony Caminiti wasn't too bad for the Saints. Him and Mateus Philippou both kind of did okay in the circumstances against Melbourne. Cooper Harvey kind of stood up a little bit and had a nice goal against Geelong. So some of those guys, and then some of those outside players who maybe not honourable mentions this week, I think they were still very good this week. Elijah Hewitt and Josh Weddle, they're right outside that top 8 along with Matt Johnson. So a bit of pressure on the likes of Judd McVie and if George Wardlaw plays or not this week.
Yep. All right, so moving over to, Pendles on the weekend broke the all-time disposal record.
Yeah.
So now we're looking at who is next in line to break that after Pendles.
I mean, bloody hard.
Yeah.
Really hard. Longevity is the big factor here. As much as I think ball winning is certainly gone up, particularly over the career span of the Pendles has been in the league. I think he's averaging shy of 26 touches a game. And then a lot of our premium midfielders in the competition are kind of going at 27, 28, 29. But they need to be playing 370 to 400 games. So that's kind of a bit of the maths that we've done with this one. Pendles signed on for next year, in line to play 400 if he kind of plays out this season and plays most of next season. So if he plays at 400 games, we're looking at about 10,364 at an average. It's in that sort of, so 10,360 odd touches is kind of that benchmark. If Pendles, and that's if he hangs up the boots at the end of next year, he could go on for a couple more years. So among the players that have at least played 50 or more games, Clary's number 1 for touches per game, and that's ever. So he's going at, I think it's 29.31 touches a game. He'd still need to be playing almost 200 more games at his rate. Now, this is a conversation we probably would have had a bit more confidently a few weeks ago, but obviously his ongoing injuries kind of put a bit of an asterisk as to, how much he'll be playing, at least this year as well. But he's a player that so durable across the first 150 games of his career. So here's an interesting one. Sam Walsh would be needing to go at his rate. I think he's currently at 27.46 touches a game from 93 games. So he'd be needing a 377 game career, which is about where Pendles is now. But the higher average, and that's assuming that Pendles is playing 400 games. So 377 games. Walsh, and then Nick Dacos is probably the one yet to play 50 games, 41. And he's going at about 28 touches a game from his first 41. So it's not like he's had the chance to have that slow start and then extend it. So God knows how high he could go. But yeah, he's probably that maybe the favourite if you're going to pick one. But just looking at the numbers, it's going to be extremely hard to see anyone kind of surpass Pendles. Maybe a couple of those, Jack McRae, Zach Merritt, some of those outside players that aren't going to be hit around as much are probably the ones that could. But we're talking, another 200 games, and players need to be, like Pendles, getting at least 370, 380 games under their belt by the end of their careers.
Yeah. So if you had to pick one to break the record, it'd be Dacos?
Yeah. Like it's, bloke's played 41 games, but, just his hold on the game at the moment as a 41-game player. The fact that he's going to be probably playing 50 games in his first 2 seasons just goes to show if they can keep that up, he's well on track. Yeah,
I'd be picking Dacos as well. And speaking of Nick Dacos, he is the new leader in our MVP.
Yep. Perfect. It was going to always be a pretty big game at the top on Friday night when we had the Bont just ahead of Nick Dacos, and Dacos put on a show, a couple goals, heaps of touches, as we've come to get ourselves familiar with this season. But another 20-vote game. So he's one of 4 players, I think, for 20 votes this week. Rosie, Stephen May, Zach Merritt, and that 20-vote game sees him go past the Bont and now have a pretty handy lead at the top. Tintoretto had, I think, just the 1 vote for the weekend, as did the Bont, so there's small movement there. Christian Petrarca had 12 votes in third, and then the likes of, I think it's your Neils, your Dawsons, still polled, but Zach Merritt is the one that's really coming up at the moment. As mentioned before, a 20-vote game from him against Adelaide. It's going to be interesting on Brownlow night, I think, if he had such a good run home last year to kind of poll so strongly in the back end. If he does something similar like that, he's going to be right at the top. The issue is, though, he copped that 1-game ban earlier in the year. So Dacos would have to slow down by some margin, as would the likes of Bont, maybe Butters, Taranto. This is Brownlow speaking, but no players are ineligible for MVP. But it'd be an interesting story if Merritt keeps this up and some of those leaders slow down a bit. So a little bit there. And then a fun little one as well from the weekend. Geelong North Melbourne, our 4 voters couldn't decide on a best on ground evenly. So we had 4 different players getting the 5 votes. I think it was Atkins, Myers, Stewart and Duncan. So I don't think that doesn't happen too often, or it might not have happened at all, at least this year. So a bit of an interesting outcome in our MVP.
Yeah, good stuff. And to wrap up, we're going to be answering some of your questions that have come through Instagram. So a lot of questions came through about how the top 8 and how the finals are shaping up. So one person asked, Bombers, finals, maybe. Another one asked, is the top 8 locked in? And the last one is Collingwood, Port and Brisbane the only teams that can win it. A little bit of a flashback to 2002 to 2004. What do you reckon?
So for that last question, I don't think they're the only 3. I think there's certainly that a bit of daylight between them. I don't think you can rule out Melbourne at all, to be honest. And I think Geelong might be similar, maybe on a rung below the Demons, but I think there's a 5 there. I probably won't buy into Essendon just yet. From a premiership point of view, I think they're a good finals contending club, and maybe they're below the Cats, but I'd be cutting it off at the 5. But I don't think they're the only 3. The Pies, Port and Lions are certainly the strongest 3, and maybe in that order. But I wouldn't be ruling out Melbourne and probably not Geelong either.
Yep. So top 8 locked in.
I think we had this discussion maybe a month or so ago at looking at the top 8 at that point, and saying they were probably the 8 strongest sides in finals contention. But it's certainly changed since then with the likes of GWS turning their season around a little bit. I think when we had that conversation as well, the Gold Coast just after that got on that run up in the NT, and they've kind of fluctuated a little bit. Carlton, their last 3 weeks have been promising. Game against Port Adelaide is kind of going to be the real one that gives us a read on where Carlton are at. So no, certainly not locked in at this top 8 at least. I think Adelaide, who are currently sitting outside, are probably one that comes in, as we saw with our ladder predictor a couple of weeks ago. And you look at, I think that group between, I think it's about 6th, all the way down to maybe 12th. A lot of those clubs have all had losses in recent weeks to sides in that similar bracket, and some there's none that are on these big winning runs. Maybe Giants are one of those, and they've got some good challenges coming up, like Adelaide this week. So Yeah, no, certainly not locked in by
Well,
any means.
in our ladder predictor, we did have the Saints dropping out as well.
Yeah.
And last week we had that question about if Carlton go over to Freo and beat them, are they back in the hunt? So there is a lot of movement.
There's
a lot to be
it's so
decided.
tight at the moment. And as we kind of mentioned, the draw with Sydney and Geelong and how Richmond are going. There's so many at play here. It's really anyone that's sitting maybe above that bottom three. Sydney have kind of fallen off a little bit, but and as have Freo, but yeah, above them, anyone.
Yeah.
Anyone.
But I'm ruling Sydney out. I don't think they're going to be making
Done?
it. But
Yeah, tough one.
And so another question that came through from Penella Transport, Ken Hinkley, is he going to be re-signing?
All the signs point to it, don't they? Like, it'd be real surprise. You'd assume Port want him there. You have to assume that Hinkley wants to be there, just the way that the group's sort of stuck together at the moment and the way they're playing. So it'd be a shock if he wasn't there, where he would be. If he's coaching next year, but it's either at Port or Gold Coast maybe, but no, I'd be rubber stamping that one.
I'd be pretty surprised if they don't re-sign him.
Yep.
All right, so that wraps it up for Zero Hanger TV today. Thanks, Mitch.
Thanks, Phoenix.
Don't forget, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel. Also, keep an eye out on our socials where we'll be asking for questions most weeks. And you can catch all the latest AFL news at zerohanger.com.